All right, I am really happy to be back on this stage for the third year in a row. I'm much happier to be here in person than I was last year, where I know I was beamed in via the internet from summer in Australia to winter in Ireland. I realise there's a couple of things that I should do at the outset here in thinking about the fact that this is themed around the notion of place. All Australian events of this ilk begin with the same ritual these days. We begin by acknowledging that we meet on the lands of our traditional owners in Australia, so on the lands of the Aboriginal people of that place. And for us, it's a way of grounding every conversation in both our histories and our presents and our futures. And in so doing, also acknowledging that in Australia, at least, we meet on lands that have been continuously occupied for 60,000 years, and we like to do honour to that. But it occurs to me that that same ritual works here. So I'd like to acknowledge that we meet on the traditional lands of the Irish, and I want to pay my respects to your elders, past and present, and to your leaders emerging, and to thank you yet again for the privilege of getting to be at the edge of the world. And I realised that I wanted to do something in particular here. You've just heard two very important and significant conversations about the nature of the world we find ourselves in, and in the nature of the technical systems that are being built in that world. And you've heard a series of conversations about some of the companies that are building that future. I'm not sure I'd call them all technology companies. I sometimes think they're advertising companies, and they're certainly software companies. And I realise that may be a splitting of hairs, but for me there's something about paying attention to the pieces that we're building and the futures that we're making that require having lots of different conversations. Philip suggested I might be a more positive influence here. That's not usually my role. But I thought what I would do was talk a little bit about how those very same technologies we've spent the last 2 hours talking about bring other possibilities too. They're not just the technologies of surveillance and of capitalist enterprise. They are also technologies suffused with remarkable other possibilities, and I want to dwell on some of those, at least for the next half an hour. I realise there's a couple of things you should know about me before I start that, though. For those of you who have not had to endure me before, here are the pieces you need to know. I'm an anthropologist by training. I'm also the child of an anthropologist. I grew up on my mother's field sites in central and northern Australia and in Indonesia in the 1970s and 1980s. I spent my childhood living in places with Aboriginal people who remembered their first sight of cattle, their first sight of Europeans, their first sight of fences, not always in that order, and who for the entire arc of my childhood took me onto their country and told me their stories. And that was an incredibly privileged and remarkable childhood. I spoke an Aboriginal language, Warlpiri. I didn't go to school terribly often, so don't ask me to do long division. And I got to kill things and then eat them. Basically, best childhood ever. And it's a very long way from Alikarang, where I grew up, to Silicon Valley, where I've spent the last 20 years, and a longer way instead back to Australia, where I've now been for the last 18 months. It's a journey that was in some ways shaped by one single thing, which was my mother's incredible instruction that you should have a life of meaning. And for her, it was about a moral obligation that your work should be in the service of creating a world that was better than the one that you found yourself in. And that work should be in the service of a better world for everyone, not just for yourself. And so every job I've held, every decision I've made in some ways has been riven through that particular lens. That kept me for 20 years in Silicon Valley. That kept me working inside large American technology companies as an anthropologist, where I think my job was to haunt the company with people. Stories of what actual human beings were doing, not what was technically possible, but what people wanted. And so my job was, as Philip often reminds me, as a storyteller. I told stories about people, about what they wanted, about what they cared about what frustrated them, about what they hoped for their kids, their communities, their countries even, and how we could use all of that to prime technological innovation. Because it's not just enough to work out what's technically possible, you have to work out what people actually want. And the interplay between those two things is, for me, the most interesting place to have a conversation. Over the last 5 years, that means that I've been preoccupied by one thing and one thing in particular, and it's the thread that runs through the last conversations and this one, which is about the notion of data and about the relationship between data and our futures and about what that data has made possible. 5 years ago, if you were in a tech company, we were talking about big data. 2 years ago, we started talking about artificial intelligence. In some ways, those are the same conversations. They are conversations about where the technology goes and what it means. Now, you heard AI mentioned a couple of times on this stage. I often think that one of the things we need to do first is define that. And I like to go back old school to 1956. 1956 was the first time the phrase artificial intelligence was used. It was actually coined at a conference in Dartmouth in America by a group of mathematicians and philosophers and one behavioral psychologist. B.F. Skinner has a lot to answer for usually, and this is one of those moments. Nonetheless, a group of men gathered in Dartmouth. Their goal was to think about what was the power of computing going to make possible. And you have to remember in 1956, computers had gone from being electronic calculators through the ENIAC in 1946, world's first stored program computer, which was about the size of this room and didn't do very much. Took the power of 6 suburbs to do 1 kilobit of microprocessing. Basically, you need 1 million of them to get to a cell phone, and by that point you would have used all of the electricity in Ireland. Not a good look. But there'd been the ENIAC in 46, but by 1956 computers had gotten increasingly more powerful. And for people who were using them, there was this question about where was it all going, and what would you do with all that processing power? And for a number of those people, the preoccupation was to say, well, maybe what those computers should be able to do is think like humans. And really, that wasn't it. It wasn't think like humans, it was think better than humans. Because in 1956, the men gathered in Dartmouth were men who had seen the worst that humans could do. They'd lived through pieces of World War II. They'd seen the Holocaust. They'd seen the nuclear bomb. They were pretty convinced that the human and his intellect was at best messy and at worst dangerous. And what they hoped to do was create machinery that would be better. Machinery that would not be subject to the vagaries of human whims, that would be neat and tidy and possibly good. They set out an agenda for themselves, 4 key things they thought they could teach computers to do. One was to use language, human language in this instance. Secretly, one of the underlying agendas in 1956 was that the Americans hoped that they could have computers that would understand Russian. Not simultaneous translation, but instantaneous translation. Of course, unsurprisingly to anyone in this room who speaks more than one language, the people who were doing this didn't realize that words weren't just words, they were meanings. And as a result, they thought if they could just translate the words and not have to think about the meaning, it would get them somewhere. The delightful apocryphal tale that's told about the failure of this moment has to do with a phrase that was translated into Russian, then back into English. The phrase is, "The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." By the time it came back through translation, through 2 computing systems, the phrase had become, "The vodka is strong and the meat is bad." We had effectively moved from Ecclesiastics to a restaurant review. Imagine here that the problem is that language isn't just about words, it's about meaning. So 1956, we hoped we could make computers understand how we talked. We hoped we could help them form abstractions and concepts, so be able to think symbolically. My personal favorite is solve the kinds of problems now reserved for humans. I still don't quite know what they imagined that was in 1956, and then improve themselves. 4 pretty straightforward things, right? Basically, how did you make a machine think like a person? Well, it needed to understand language. It needed to understand high-level thinking. It needed to be able to manage that in some way, and then it needed to be able to improve itself. It's a pretty bold goal in 1956. It's still a bold goal in 2018. And guess what? There's multiple pieces of that turn out to be interesting. But because I'm here, and because other voices will be down the road in just a few hours, I realized we should pause briefly and contemplate what computers might have done. I didn't bring the music because it would be an insult to everyone in this room, and particularly to Philip, were I to play it. But this is a computer. This is called CIRAC. This is Australia's first stored memory computer. It's the second stored memory computer in the world. It was turned on in 1947, and in 1950 it was used to make music. The music was genuinely dreadful. The review of that music in the local paper in Melbourne described it as a combination of a very angry refrigerator and a door that you hoped would shut. The fact that it played what we all know as the ubiquitous theme song from Bridge Over the River Kwai just doesn't really bear repeating. So here's this machine. It's taught to make music. It was taught to make music in 1950. It made music all the way into the 1960s. The notion that computational technology would make art is hardly new. Indeed, this object here is the first piece of art created by a computer. This is called Return to a Square. It's used Fortran, so the very first programming language made for IBM in 1956, to make a piece of art. This was done by a computing group in Japan, and it premiered in London at an exhibit in the Design Museum on the Thames called Cybernetic Serendipity. It was an exhibit entirely dedicated to bringing together the notions of computational technology and art. There was music, there was haiku, there was graphic art, there was possibly my favorite compute object ever by a British satirist from Punch magazine by the name of Roland Emmett. Many of you would know Roland Emmett because if you're my age, you knew him because he made the machines in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. Honeywell Computing, in a moment of I do not know what, irrational exuberance, commissioned him to make an object for the Cybernetic Serendipity exhibit called the Peripheral Pachyderm, which was a computer that remembered things, hence the name elephant. Don't even ask. I do not know what they were thinking. What I do know is that the linking back in 1968 between computers and creativity was entirely possible. No one at that point imagined that computers would be instrumentalist objects that just did spreadsheets. They thought they might make art. Those possibilities closed down again in the 1960s, in the 1970s, in the 1980s. And really, for me, it's not until quite recently that we could start to ask this question again. Could we make wonder with computers? Could we make art? And if so, what would it look like to make it with AI? I was arguing with a colleague of mine this morning in Australia about whether it is a reasonable thing to suggest that computers should make art, or why she said to me, would you even want AI to make art? She's like, shouldn't you leave that to humans? And my response to her, which is the argument I want to litigate here, was to say, listen, here's the thing. The tools that humans most value are the tools that let us do more than one thing. Every tool that had a functional purpose also made art. We made fire, but fire gave us charcoal. Charcoal let us decorate the walls and our bodies. We made instruments to carry water, and we turned them over and made them into percussive moments. Everything we ever made that was a technology was also a possibility for making art or beauty or splendor or wonder, so why should this be any different? In fact, frankly, when I think about what it might mean to take some of these technologies out of the places they find themselves and put them back in the hands of citizens, not consumers, one of the arguments might be, how is it that we use these technologies not to make more things, but to make wonder and splendor and beauty? So what might that look like? I want to give you 5 quick examples because I know that's a bit heavy. Well, number one, we talked a lot about data, right? Here's the thing about data, and I like that I get to be in Ireland to say this because this will make sense to you in a way that it never seems to make sense in, say, America. Data is what makes artificial intelligence possible. Yes, it's about computation, but that computation needs to be fueled by something. It needs to have a world that it is fed, basically. Data is the fuel of artificial intelligence. But it is also artificial intelligence's original sin. Whatever the data is will frame the world. Thinking about where that data comes from, who collected it, and why, are all hugely important questions for how we start to think about the worlds that are being built. Think about the conversation you just heard about what data is being collected about us, about the somewhat disturbing picture that there are naked images of us on the internet. Naked both in actual sense and naked for the ways in which we are revealed. And then imagine the world that will be built using all that data. And then think about how might you invert that to do something else. Well, you might be the performance artist in Japan who hacked his Roomba, his robotic vacuum cleaner, and turned its dust-sucking vents into paint-blowing vents, and let the algorithm of cleaning his floors become the algorithm of painting. And his Roomba makes art. I don't recommend this for your lawnmower, Eamon, although it would be an interesting thing to watch. But his notion was, if it has computation, maybe we can subvert it and make it into something else. So maybe the pattern of the cleaning can be art. Caltech understands this, so the California Institute of Technology. They have a conceptual artist on their payroll. He sits inside the university and his job is to take art and use it to create different kinds of data visualizations, to work with scientists and mathematicians and other kinds of academics to help them think differently about how they might see the world. You're doing this here too. This will be one of the things that goes on at Trinity. This is part of how we think about the digital humanities. This is about how we imagine data telling us different stories and creating different patterns and different possibilities. It also means how might we start to imagine data looking differently, how might we want to collect it differently. I wonder here whether that means that you could ever use data to create art. Of course, the reality is we've always used that. Think about pointillism, think about abstract art. Those were all about using the world and then subverting it in some small and simple way. But think about all of the conversations we just had about data and surveillance, and imagine that you instead were using your data trails to create rude words. Maybe that's just an Australian thing, but there is a man in Western Australia who has been quite sensibly using his Fitbit tracking data to spell out obscene words across the Western Australian landscape. It requires a certain degree of precision and an enormous amount of perseverance to spell words quite that long. Well, come on, you know you're secretly dying to try it. It's also the case sitting inside AI, after data comes algorithms, right? First you have the data, then you need to do something with them, and what you do with them is automate processes. That's how AI works, right? And that's how technical systems work, is you take a set of data and you make a process on top of it. And algorithms and computation aren't intimately associated, right? If you use a washing machine, you've used an algorithm. Because every time you've used a washing machine, somewhere there is a delicate cycle. In that delicate cycle, someone has decided cold water, low rinse, low agitation. You press one button, it does three things. That's all an algorithm is. That's what's happening in the world around us. That's certainly what's happening with the Facebooks and Googles of this world, though those algorithms are about knowing you better than you know yourself in order to ensure that you can be sold something. Those are recommendation algorithms. They help us parse the world. But what might it mean to turn that on its head, right? What would it mean rather than suggest, here's a thing that's like all the other things you had, what would it be to have an algorithm that said, all right, Genevieve, we know you're back in Dingle. We know more than anything in the world you need to be going to Bean in Dingle because best coffee and good coffee is hard to come by. But before you go there, there's a piece of art you should go see. There's a view you should go look at. There's something else you should do instead. So rather than allowing the logic of a kind of instrumentalist thinking to pervade here, what would it mean if we, rather than thinking about automation as a shortcut, turned it into a disruption? What would it mean to imagine that you could architect for encounters of delight and serendipity and wonder, not just encounters of coffee shops and the next pair of shoes and the television show you should watch? What would it mean to disrupt all of that? I don't know, but I think it would be an interesting adventure. Third set of things that sit under AI, and I think are another opportunity for how we might imagine wonder, have to do with learning. Remember I said the thing about AI was that the hope was that the machine would learn for itself? Well, one of the challenges at the moment is the way we teach computers to learn for themselves is by giving them examples that have already happened. So one of the complicated things about data, and arguably about artificial intelligence, is that they're inherently conservative, because they're always backward looking. The thing about data is it's what's already happened, not what will happen. So what is being codified is the world as it has been, not the world as we might want it to be. And it tends to make it quite hard to imagine new things if what you are doing is creating and stabilizing the world as it is. It's also quite hard to learn beyond that framework, right? The way we teach machines to learn, machine learning, is incredibly structurally stable. There's no body for a machine in that sense. It's a statistical model, if this, then that. Think about how all of us learnt. I'm willing to bet I'm not the only person in this room who learnt what was possible by doing what I was told not to do. Thank you, Mark. I heard that. Very good. Some of us learnt because we broke the rules and then saw what happened. Others of us learnt because we saw the looks on the faces of the people around us. We felt shame, we felt pleasure, we felt pride. We knew that we were doing things that mattered or were very, very naughty indeed, judging by the responses around us. Our bodies mattered in that sense, right? We were embodied creatures. At the moment, computation is rarely embodied and it doesn't experience feedback in quite that sense. It can be corrected, but it can't necessarily be shamed or embarrassed. It's interesting then to also imagine, if you think that these machines are being taught in straightforward ways, how it might mean to imagine teaching a machine to be creative. Is that possible? At the moment, we know how to teach computation to copy. There are flawless and exquisite versions of art being made by computational objects, good enough that buyers are willing to purchase them. The open question is, are they art? And the harder question is, what would it mean to have an object that was created with what we tend to think of as the human impulse, something a little bit magical? I don't know how we would teach machines to learn creativity, but I suspect it's a problem that should preoccupy us more than it does, because I think this is not just a problem for art, but a problem for society. And then last, but by no means least, one of the other things that comes into sharp relief for me as I think about artificial intelligence this way is that I said a minute ago the machines don't have bodies. That's true, but they do have ways of encountering the world. Cameras, sensors, GPS. They have ways of making sense of the world around them and of creating new ways of seeing and hearing and listening and knowing. Humans historically have taken great advantage of that. Whether you believe that photography is art or not, whether you believe that synthesizers make real music or not, we have used new technologies in our art for a really long time. Whether it was the use of lenses and optical frameworks in the 15th and 16th centuries, whether it's ideas about new kinds of pigments, whether it is in fact photography, whether it is AutoCAD, whether it is f-stops. We've had all kinds of ways where we have taken the latest technologies and made them into a way that we could make things. It is wonderful for me to begin to imagine what might you do with the images created by computer vision. What might you do with the trails created by Wi-Fi? What might you do with all of that data to make new ways of seeing the world? We know a little bit about this in VR and AR. I was talking to someone just a minute ago about the notion of AR and VR arcades in Indiana, of all places, but I've seen them in LA and San Francisco. There is certainly new art being made in VR. Lynn Woodworth's piece, Collisions, would be my favorite example of that currently. We know that these technologies are being repurposed to make things that aren't just about work. And the possibility there is quite remarkable of what the machines might learn and how we might also take something from that. And of course, last but by no means least, how do you put all of that back together with a notion that you might need to make magic? Because for me, the thing about AI, it's not about the pieces, it's about what happens when it all comes back together again. One of the challenges here at the moment is the way we know how to think about artificial intelligence is about things like throughput and workloads and electricity spends and the power of the microprocessor and the amount of data processed and efficiencies. Of course, the thing about all of those metrics is that's only one piece of the puzzle of what makes us human and only one piece of the puzzle about what makes an interesting and compelling society. So what might it be to suggest that actually one of the ways we should think about this is not about efficiency but about creativity? How might we drive for different bundling up of that technology if we thought it was in that service, and what would that look like? And of course that wouldn't be the first time that technology has changed our relationships to creativity, right? We've automated things in the past. I would say, yeah, some of it's uncertain. I'm certainly a child old enough to remember Australian pubs that had a pianola in them. So an automatic piano. I don't know if that word works in this country, but the notion of a piano and a roll that played itself, Philip reasonably says that's putting him out of a job. And of course, we all know it was unsatisfactory music. But the notion that there might be ways of taking all of this technology and making new possibilities ought to be something in some ways that we looked forward to and we asked hard questions about, rather than suggesting that it's a replacement. I think of it as a possibility. We know that people made extraordinary art when they could make movies. We know they made extraordinary art when they could take photos, when they could make computer games. So what is it that we will make here? Yes, this technology has the possibility to be autonomous and without us, but it won't go there until we make it. So what are we going to put in it that means that when it becomes artificially intelligent, it's not intelligence that's just about language, but it's about those other things that humans are capable of, which I suspect, for me, is mostly about art. We started here with a kind of conversation that the last time I was here last year, I was talking about building something new in Australia. I'm still building something new in Australia. The happy news I have to report is that in the last year since I spoke to people here, my little tiny institute that is hell-bent on building the applied science that will manage all of that technology I was just talking about has gone from being 3 people to 12. We start our first graduate program next year. We had a call out on social media, and I thank everyone in the room who rebroadcasted that for me. We did a 5-week call for students for next year. We got 173 applicants from all over the world for just 10 slots. That was 173 people willing to put their lives on hold for a year to come to a degree program that didn't have a name in a city that if you'd ever been there you wouldn't be dying to go. And they were willing to do it simply because they thought it was as compelling as I think it is. And that for me was an extraordinary moment. Those of you who know anything about Australia will know that we gamble about everything. We were running a pool about how many students we would have, and we stopped taking bets at 120. So the fact that we got 173 was kind of remarkable. We're taking 16 of those students. They arrive in February, and we'll start building. Because for me, the only way to think about making a new applied science is to start by building it. It's the same way I want to think about all those AI pieces, right? The only way to think about doing something about them is not just to critique them, but to build an alternative. So for those of you who helped last year, I'm deeply grateful. Here's the thing, though. The reason I came back to Ireland, the reason I keep being everywhere, is that I know if you want to build something new, if you want to imagine a new world, you can't ever do it by yourself. And I'm profoundly grateful to Island's Edge, to Other Voices, to Intel here, to Trinity, to all the places that have been helping us, and I'm incredibly grateful that I get to keep coming back here, but I need help. Because it's one thing to stand up and decide you're going to build a new applied science. As Eamon pointed out to me yesterday, I have serious notions. And I like having notions, because although that's culturally impossible in Australia too, I'm keeping them. And my notion here is that I'm going to do this, but I know I'm not going to do it by myself. It's like anything worthy, you should never do it alone. You should do it with friends and with co-conspirators and with co-interlocutors and with champions. And there are people in the room that have been that for me, and so I'm deeply and profoundly grateful, but I'm not done asking for help. So, if you suddenly feel a need to come to Canberra, if you want to come and talk to me about building a new applied science, that's how you track us down. And in the meantime, I wanted to do two more things. One was to say thank you again, and the second was to reflect that every time we talk about the future and we talk about what's technically possible, I want to make sure that we're not just talking about it from a point of view of enterprise and of commerce. I want to make sure that we're talking about it from a point of view of culture and of engagement and of creativity and of what's possible. Because for me, those questions are the really interesting ones. They're also the ones that challenge technologists to do more and to do better. So with that, I want to stop and say thank you.